Okay, well, welcome to 9A Projects at Robinwood Mill. In case you don't know anything about us or you've never been here before, we are an independent, volunteer-led contemporary gallery. It's me and 3 other people. We took the lease on the space just before COVID, so then we were paying for an empty space for 2 years. But since we opened, after the COVID restrictions ended, we've managed to have, this will be the 7th exhibition, which we're very pleased about as an unfunded organisation to make this kind of stuff happen. And we're really, really pleased to be having IOU show their work in the space. We've never had a big installation. We've had sculpture, painting, film, photography, printmaking, drawing-based work, but this is the first time we've had a work of this scale in here, which is great for us. In case you don't know about IOU, you did say 1:30. See,
well timed.
This might happen every time we say the words IOU. Seriously? Okay. IOU is a leading producer of interdisciplinary, site-specific contemporary art. As a company, they've been devising, making and touring work nationally and internationally for 40 years, which is amazing. They site and create artworks for unexpected locations, both indoors and out. Their productions cross boundaries between art forms and organisations. They take inspiration from the culture, landscape and industrial past of their home here in Calderdale. And they combine making skills and emerging technologies to constantly surprise and confound our expectations. And today we're very lucky to have the 2 of the key artists who've worked on this piece. We have Louise Oliver and Richard Wincer. Now, Louise Oliver is a visual artist and a writer. She studied fine art at Reading University and Wolverhampton Art College. She's a founder member of IOU Theatre. And as one of the company's core artists, she's worked as a maker, performer, writer, and co-deviser of productions. Her writing work includes plays for BBC Radio 4, as well as song lyrics and monologues for theatre. An experience of serious illness in the family led her to study metaphysics and to train in holistic therapies. This shift also saw her return to painting and mixed media artwork, and she exhibits work locally at Water Street Gallery in Todmorden. Richard Wincer trained in fine art at Goldsmiths. His practice covers sculpture, installations and painting. Richard's work has been exhibited at the Serpentine, the Whitechapel and Haywood Galleries. He's had recent solo shows at Touchstones Gallery in Rochdale and here at Robinwood Mill, not in this space but in Matthew Holding's gallery, which is called Studio 2 and is on the floor below us. Richard has also had a long-standing relationship with IOU as an artist and a maker. I know these introductions are going on a little long, but this is what happens when it's all about collaborations. 2 Rivers, the name of the piece that's here at the moment. I mean, it's quite intriguing, and lots of people have asked me every time they've walked in the door, you know, what is this about? Can you tell me something about this 2 Rivers? And so I was determined to find a really good answer to this question because I was being asked every day. And I think I found it in that on the other side of this mill, on the hill, in that direction, is the source of the 2 Calders, the Lancashire Calder and the Yorkshire Calder. So we have these 2 rivers. We're on the border between Yorkshire and Lancashire here. And they spring virtually in the same point on the moor. One goes in that direction and one comes in this direction. So we found our two rivers. And because this is an early textile mill, the Yorkshire Calder runs directly under the mill because it was the original source of power for the machinery. So I think it's quite fitting that we have two rivers in a place where the two rivers originate. So that's enough of my introductions. We met and had quite an interesting conversation the other day when we knew we were having to do this. And I thought it might be a useful way to begin the conversation is to explore something about the origin of this piece, or the origins of this piece. Because in the conversations that we've had, there are threads of this piece in an earlier work that was called Long Division. Yeah. And I think that took place initially in the Botanic Gardens in Oxford. So if you could tell us a little bit about, if you like, not the source of the river, but the source of this piece in the work
Oxford.
that happened there.
It was 2008, and I went with the then producer of IOU to Oxford. We had the idea of making a piece that would be predominantly sound-based, possibly in different locations around the city. But when we got there, somebody said we should go and meet someone from Oxford Contemporary Music, as they were organising a festival for the Oxford Botanic Gardens. And that really steered the way that the show came about, because their festival was called the Magic Hour, and the theme was twilight. So the idea was that people came into the Botanic Gardens, which is a really big place, and as the light was falling and changing, they would walk around the gardens and experience lots of different sound pieces. So you would hearing all sorts, lots of different people were doing things. There was a man from New York who was recording the bird song and then playing it back to the birds, and then recording the birds responding, and there were all sorts of different things. We at first couldn't work out where to. It was such a lovely place, but it was actually quite hard to find a focus for where to place ourselves. And we eventually decided on this area where there was a very beautiful tree. It's a huge black pine tree that Tolkien used to sit under. And they say that Tolkien, he loved this tree and he used to sit there and write. And it had a very particular sort of atmosphere about it. And two of the garden walls converged in the corner at a gate. And so we made use of that whole corner. And actually the last photograph that was ever taken of Tolkien was taken under that tree about almost exactly 50 years ago. But it since had to be pulled down because the branches started to fall off and it was considered dangerous, which is a shame. But the tree was very much a focal point. And it's a collaboration, as Kelly said, there's a collaboration of different people working on the piece. And we were very much, at the time, playing with the idea of the sound washing along, the sound moving, if you like, so that when the audience walked along the paths and across the grass, the sound would sort of follow them, or it kind of washed up and down the walls and was quite elusive. So that sound piece is the basis for the sound you hear now. That's what's carried over into Two Rivers. And that sound is based on, I began with the theme of twilight. I started to write something that we could record, And I came across a Persian form of poetry called a ghazal, which is very, very specific. It's quite hard. It has a very specific rhythm, very strict rules about where the rhymes fall and which lines rhyme with which, and it's actually a really sort of tight structure. And I decided to write one because that form of poetry is very much about the theme of love and loss and longing. And I started to envisage twilight as a time when the day and the night very briefly meet each other. So it's neither day nor night. They're kind of, if you like, their paths are very briefly crossing. And writing that poem started the idea of the voices being the day and the night. It was a male and a female voice, and writing a whole series of rhyming couplets. And they were based around the minutes of the hour, because just as this bell may well go off any minute, the thing about the Botanic Garden was it was right by Magdalen College in Oxford. And this bell, this massive, huge bell that you couldn't possibly ignore, went off every quarter of an hour, and even more so on the hour. So we decided to very much incorporate that into the piece. And so it was built around the minutes of the clock, and there was a couplet for the male and the female for every minute of the hour. So that was 120 in all. And Dan Morrison we recorded the rhyming couplets, myself and Chris Squire, and Dan Morrison took that recording and kind of manipulated the voices, stretched them, played with them. I don't know the name of the software that he uses, but on computer, he created the soundtrack that you hear. So there's nothing on that sound that isn't human voice, apart from the bell. So all of the different echoing sounds all come from those lines of poetry. And the idea of twilight, that sort of blue hour, when I think the French call it the blue hour. It's the time when you're kind of in between things. And I think that theme is very much something that IOU plays with a lot, kind of in between places, in between times, when you're kind of on the threshold of one reality and the next. And that formed the basis of the sound, which then influenced the carvings that Richard did.
And the slates, lots of people are kind of curious about the slate as well.
Well, the text was written out on the slates, and the slates were laid across the grass like a path that people could follow. And it really interested me that when I heard about this tree, Tolkien's tree, being felled, apparently when the branch fell, that they decided that the tree was dangerous. This huge branch fell right across the grass, right across the path where we laid the slates. I remember thinking, oh wow, I don't know what the significance of that is, but it was, so yeah, they were a pathway, and we lit it with candles, and they had tiny speakers in the bushes that were hidden in the bushes. It operated differently than this does technically, but
there's still that sense of a kind of a movement and a journey through sound as well.
Yeah, people were free to follow it around, and purely by what they could hear, really. There was actually very little visual. The gardens themselves were enough visual, because some of the plants that at that time of twilight, You get scented plants that you can that only emit their scent at that time of day and things like that. So it's quite a sensory experience, you know, walking through the gardens.
And I'm going to try and bring Richard in here now, because I'm going to emphasise this a lot, by the way, this connection between IOU and having collaboration at its centre. And you to have been involved in so many of these collaborations with people, with different materials, with different practices. But I was very surprised to hear that this is the first occasion in which you've actually collaborated closely with one another.
With Louise.
Yes.
Yeah.
And how was that?
In fact, we
as an
collaborated
experience?
so well. We went off and got married just afterwards. So good a collaboration. Anyway, well, I mean, I get brought in as a fine artist, and thanks to IOU, I've worked on a few things and made some sculpture for them in the past. And one of the things I worked on was Fulcrum. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was a production that IOU did of an animated film, and I built a sort of stage set, which was some carvings, which I did for Fulcrum. And so these carvings are a follow-on from Fulcrum, but one of the things that I do as a fine artist, I do woodcuts and printmaking. And I've always been struck by the fact that sometimes when I'm working on a wooden board or a wooden panel and I've inked up the print and I've taken the paper print off, how nice the actual wooden panel itself is with the ink on. And as a sculptor as well, visually I like the wooden panels. I started to like the wooden panels more sometimes than the actual paper prints. So that gave me the idea that it might be interesting just to have a dark stained piece of wood and then do the carvings and leave them as they were. I mean, ideally, we could still take prints off every one of these surfaces of these desks, but I like them as they are, as carved sculptural objects. I think one of the things I'd like to get back to what Louise was talking about, that as an artist, I always feel that in order to get some truth out of your work, you sort of delve into your unconscious, and sometimes that's when, you know, that moment when you're falling asleep or you're just waking up in the morning, when the twilight and the early morning is a special time when things can suddenly float into your head. Well, I find that quite often, where the barrier between unconscious and the conscious world breaks down, and that's what I particularly like about twilight and early morning. And getting back to Two Rivers, my childhood was spent I had a rural upbringing in Worcestershire, and I used to go fishing a lot, and I've had a big relationship with water and places throughout my life. And I still do a lot of fishing, but so I'm very, very into rural landscape and water. So this sort of Two Rivers project suited me very well. And related to the twilight, there's a saying in fishing: you fish early or you fish late, but it's worth it. And I think that's one of the. I can remember sitting on riverbanks and canal banks just as the sun's going down and the darkness comes, and that's when the big fish start coming out because they feel it's safer. And there's always that magic moment. So I'd like to make that connection between, as an artist, getting into your unconscious, and so I like that idea of the twilight and early morning. So Two Rivers suited me very well. It's been a great collaboration, and we worked very well on it, because one of the things that was really nice was the fact that if you give me a load of panels like this to carve, I'm thinking of fish and trees and water and flowery things. But the nice thing collaborating with Louise was that she would go away and she would research some imagery and then come back to me and say, well, I found this image, you know, or it's a Chinese guy holding a vase and pouring water over his head. And I wouldn't have normally chosen that. So Louise did the research on the images and would come to the studio and provide me with one, and I'd say, okay, I can pop that down and pop that down there. So it was very, very good for me personally, because of the new imagery that I introduced into the work. And she came up with the words as well, so I just, you know, basically carved the boards, really.
That's all.
Yeah. It was a bit daunting at first. We were a bit unsure, weren't we? But I laid them all out in the studio and thought, how am I going to carve all these?
I think that was part of it. It's that once you make a mark, obviously there's no going back, and that there's 10 pristine desks waiting to be carved, and it's, it seemed a good idea to have some way of containing it. So we mapped out a river on either side, going from the source, thinking that there's like the source of a river, there's a bridge, some stepping stones, a pool, a waterfall, whatever, a meander, and it eventually arrives at an estuary to the ocean. That gave a sort of shape. And the other shape was, again, continuing on from twilight, was thinking of the cycle of a day. So we also mapped out dawn, midday, afternoon, evening, nighttime. Tried to give the whole thing, find some way of containing it really, so that the images had a sort of a rationale as to where they might exist. And because it is very much about those cycles within cycles, really, the cycle of a day, the cycle of the river, and cycles in nature.
And weren't the images sourced from found photographs as well?
Some of
Yeah,
them.
that was quite interesting. We sort of went into old antique shops and we found, you know, old photographs from the 1930s and 50s, somewhere in France. So it's quite strange that you're picking up family photographs that have been discarded of people that you probably no longer with us, and then to take that image and sort of pop it onto a desk, it sort of gave them a new life in a very strange way. So that was a nice thing. That was one of the nice things that we did, was we went round and looking at those old photographs.
Well, I think there is a sense, and lots of people who've passed through the exhibition have picked up on it as well, that you do walk along and it's these fragments of words and little pockets of lives that are depicted all the way along. And, you know, I mean, I think there's something really, there's a really nice rhythm to it visually, as well as in terms of the audio, as you walk through the piece. And it's quite meditative at times. You know, people spend a long time over one particular image. I think when you invigilate a show day after day, you begin to see how people are moving through it and where they're halting and where they're hesitating.
I think we don't spend enough time contemplating art, really. I think there's some statistic that we spend about 4 or 5 seconds when we look at a piece of art and then pass on to the next one. And sometimes you do have to be a bit more, give things a bit more of a chance. So it's nice that you've said that. I'm glad that you've said that, because you get more from the work when you can instill that contemplative process, I think.
I think it's also that people are required to piece it together in their own way, because it is fragments and glimpses of stories, moments, and everybody who's passing through is piecing that together.
They become part of
in whatever way,
kind of the story as they're moving through. And I was really pleased that the information boards weren't at the front, because people enter the space and they hover and they're uncertain, and the first thing they do is read and think, right, what should I be doing or thinking about this? But they weren't there, so they had to encounter the entrance to this corridor, and you would see people kind of hesitate a bit and then just set off on their own journey. apart from the days when we had the school children in, where they just ran through it, climbed over it, and used charcoal to take prints and rubbings off all the beautiful carvings that Richard had done. But they had a great time, and it was as an invigilator, you know, watching the different groups of people and their reaction to it, and the kids had no hesitancy. They had no respect for whatever we might call art.
I think we did sort of toy with the idea of school desks, didn't we? Sort of like, you know, the way that kids carve into desktops. That was one of the things that we thought of at the first, you know, how you make your mark and put your initials or... and that was quite an interesting thing that we, you know, I did think about that at one point. We've got no bits of chewing gum stuck underneath or anything like that, but they do give that sort of feeling, don't they?
Yeah, and it's so kind of fundamental, isn't it, or foundational, the idea of mark making, especially scratching on surfaces like wood. And I think the kids just got on with it straight away.
It was David's idea to house the installation in the wooden desks, and it gives it it's a very different feel from the long division piece that I was describing. Was outdoors in a garden, and then it went from there to a few different venues like Salisbury Cathedral and some of the churches around Yorkshire. And it kind of quite suited church spaces, and it was very, it was very much the sound. There wasn't something housing it together in the same way. And I think making it into an avenue of desks has changed that, and putting it in a gallery space changes it too. It's, well, the sound is very different in here because it's so much more enclosed. It's not kind of... it's not as elusive, actually, is it? It's quite sort of...
It's a more intimate space, I think. Yeah.
I mean, I'm quite interested in archaeology, and when I first saw it arranged, you know, it did look like almost like a Neolithic passage, and then the tower at the end of it as you're walking through this. Yeah. So there's lots of different ways that people have, you know, connected with it or found resonance in their own background. I did want to ask something about trying to identify if there are any threads of, you know, what you might term the DNA of IOU, because it's such a long-standing organisation. And, you know, there's a sense, and I think Louise has described it in the shift between one piece of work and the other, that things are constantly, materials are constantly being reused and remade and rethought about. You know, the audio and the slates have come from a different piece, but their lifespans kind of go on. And I think that has something to do with this focus on collaboration. And I often wonder if it has any resonance with the origins of IOU in theatre, because theatre reuses everything. You know, from costumes to sets, you just repaint them, you reuse them, you remake and you adapt. So I wondered if it was that, or, you know, the centrality of collaboration in what you all do and have been doing for 40 years, because if you bring artists from different disciplines together, you inevitably surprise one another, and there's an accidental experimentation that always goes on in collaborations. So existing pieces are looked at with fresh eyes, with new ideas, and are just constantly adapted. And I think, you know, this piece demonstrates that really well. Not only is it environmentally sound that you are reusing all these materials, you know, but I think it highlights the strength of collaboration.
I think the collaboration comes about, I mean, it's a long time ago that I was at art school, or the original members of IOU were at art school, but at that time, and you know, up to the present day, the barriers between painting and sculpture and photography were being broken down. You were free as an artist to do whatever medium you wanted. So that becomes possible then in this collaboration becomes possible. You can bring in people from different disciplines to work on an installation, and it works, you know. I think that's part of the history of art installations and theatrical performances.
I think also when we made a production, it might be an object or a song or just an idea or a theme might be part of a production, but you'd realise that just that one element could be explored a lot further if you extracted it, and it might just be a prop that you'd made or a piece of writing somebody had done that then went on to be a kernel in the next production, so that there's kind of an organic, it's an organic process, you know, you're sowing the seeds all the time for something else that happens with it. I think that's part of it as well. As well as the materials, when we first started working here, there were loads of these mills. Yes. They were all empty, they were all closing down. We could walk in and they'd just give us materials. They'd give us hampers full of cloth, or, you know, we'd just go in and say, have you got anything? Yeah, take it. So we'd end up with all this stuff, you know, to make things with, and I don't think that really exists anymore.
No, you'd be charged for it, and that's for certain. But that, you know, mentioning mills, obviously we're in a mill. IOU is based in Dean Clough in what was an old carpet mill. This was a cotton spinning mill. But, you know, there's a real interesting history to be told about the mills in this valley from the 17th century? No, from the 70s, 1970s onwards. Because they were empty and the developers hadn't found them, and they afforded opportunities for artists to take up spaces and begin work in these areas. And with that in mind, I'm just going to ask one last question. Obviously, you've worked on the piece, you know it very well. You saw it first in the gallery at Dean Clough, where IOU are. And so this is, all IOU's work is toured, isn't it? And so this is its first tour. This is the first place it's landed. Yeah. So I wondered if you had, David as well as you two, any responses to the experiencing the piece in a completely different setting.
Well, yeah, I mean, Dean Clough, it was in more of a cathedral-like, there was loads of space, it was, and the sound was lost a bit more, I think. And as I said earlier, I think seeing it here is just the more intimacy of it. I think people, when they come in on their own and can experience it without any interference from people chatting in the background, like at the opening there was quite a few people here chatting and you could get the sound, but once you come in on your own and experience it, I think it has it's quite a moving thing to be here on your own and listening to it. I think that's the key. One of the things that I've found is that it's good to experience it in a solitary basis, which I personally I really like that. It's made me realise that by it being at 9A.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
And I think the desk, because they're like kind of museum desks as well, it suits that sort of museum or gallery space now, doesn't it? That you feel like you're in... there's not that many spaces that are long enough to house it. Even this space, it doesn't quite, you know, it's quite hard to...
No, it hasn't. We've had to give it a dog leg, haven't we? Because it couldn't run the whole length. But I thought it was really interesting on the day when it was being installed, and David and other people, it seemed to be go on forever, carrying desk after desk up that spiral staircase and getting it in here. And originally they were all just kind of placed over this side of the space. And when I walked through the door, it was really noticeable. It kind of echoed what it would have looked like as a spinning mill, because they were like the spinning frames that would have been here. I mean, they don't look like that now, they've been put into here, but I thought it was quite a nice echo. What do you think about it being here, David?
I really like it here. As Louise says, it's a bit like a library or something, but that quiet, the acoustics are really nice.
Yeah, it has a really kind of hushed feeling, doesn't it, when you come in?
And you can sort of read them like a scroll. It has a sort of a contemplative hush to it in here, which is really nice.
Oh, good. And obviously, because we have David here from, he's the creative director of IOU, and artistic director. But because we have founder members of this organisation, and it's something that's kind of featured in my life, because I grew up in Burnley in the 1970s, at a time when a forerunner, Welfare State International, arrived and became the artist in residence in Burnley in a disused quarry. So the first art I encountered was Welfare State, was the big kind of figures and installations that you made over in Burnley. And I mean, it wasn't just me, there was a whole kind of cohort of people my age, and that was their first, we were coming off council estates in South Burnley, and that was the first art that we experienced. And it's had this kind of ripple effect throughout a whole bunch of people who then went on to work in the arts, in kind of music or writing or curating in different ways. So it's had that intangible legacy that if you weren't one of those kids there, you wouldn't actually know about it. So it was great to have work by IOU in this space and have the kids from the local schools come and climb all over it and, start that whole process again of engaging a new generation. So that's been really big for me. And obviously you've sustained these careers, these creative lives and creative practices over this stretch of time. I'm not going to ask you what your secret is, but I'm going to ponder the question of whether this kind of thing would even be possible for young people entering art school or leaving art school at the moment, or even people working outside of that system. It seems the opportunities are kind of closed down a great deal for this generation, and so I think if you work in the arts, you do worry about what's going to happen with the structure and the possibilities for younger people coming through.
It's a very different time, definitely, and I suppose for you, Welfare State being there and the sort of odd and unusual things that were going on, it would have shown possibilities that you wouldn't even have dreamt of, I suppose. It showed you that something was possible, didn't it? And I think probably no matter the climate, creative people always find a way to do things. They always find a way. But we do live in a time where, I think of it sometimes like, it's like there's a horizontal level of things, which is sort of our everyday, ordinary lives that we all have to deal with. Is like on this horizontal, just basic life, really, that's going on. And then there's a kind of a vertical, which is to do with imagination, and people access it through the arts, poetry and music, and they access it through nature or going on a pilgrimage, or there's all sorts of ways, but it's more like a sort of vertical plane, if you like, of what's possible. And I think one of the problems we have is that horizontal everyday plane is broken. It's just breaking down around us. So you have to be quite, you have to be very thick-skinned not to notice it, not to think that is just breaking down, which leaves us in a world of a very troubled place. It leaves us with a lot of trouble to negotiate. And you need to know that you need a sense that there is this other level that you can access, and that there's hope. People want to reach a fairer, kinder, more peaceful, more creative world. This is what people want on the whole, but don't know how to get there. And unfortunately, we can't get there without going through the troubled world that we're in. We're in a time where everything is breaking down. Everything is breaking down. And it isn't possible to just build things, but it is possible to sow seeds. I think it's always possible to sow the seeds of something. And like you say, that something for you that sowed a seed of, and look what you're doing now, that may well never have happened.
Oh, yeah.
So although it was a very different world in the 70s when we just kind of went out there and did things, and half the time didn't even realise that you were supposed to have police permission to do it, you know, you just sort of went and did it. A lot of things have changed, but that drive for people to do something creative never goes away. But we need ways of people need ways of finding that doorway into something, don't they? That is, you know, where things will change.
I think, I mean, I've been a practicing artist for a long time, and it's a big struggle. And if you're involved in it, then you have to face up to the fact that you do tend to be pushed to the periphery of society if you're not careful. It's something that you just have to accept a lot of the time, and being creative is not nurtured by far nearly enough. We've sort of got ourselves involved in the material world so much. But if the drive is there, no matter the hardship, somehow you like Louise said, you do find a way. And from my, you know, I had a working class background, and my parents they had certain gifts and they weren't able to use them. And I made up my mind that if I had a gift, I would use it. I would never waste it. And it didn't have to necessarily mean fame and fortune. It just meant if I can get up in the morning and go to my studio, that is a success as far as I'm concerned, and that is how I see it.
But that was lovely. Thank you, Richard. On that note, I'm going to switch over to the audience now and see if anybody has any questions they want to ask of David, Louise, Richard. Silence. Scott.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll ask a question. I mean, it was a really amazing show. So I would describe it as a show because there's so many different visual, auditory sort of sequences throughout the whole thing. Even the relationship with the outside as well is sort of important. But thinking about the sort of relationship with water and landscapes of water and how all that works, I think is really important. The image of the chap straddling the sort of stepping stones really struck me.
Yeah.
There's a pub where I live down the valley in Leiden Road that there's a bridge there now, but that used to be how people accessed it by sort of stepping stones. And I guess we're thinking about the whole thing and people's relationships with water and especially here at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. But now how we're dealing with climate change and how that's affecting our relationship and our interactions with water. And we're seeing big, hard, industrial sort of civic engineering things happening that are severing that relationship. I think the arts are going to be a really important way for people to engage and interact with thinking about how climate change affects them. I'm just wondering how you see those relationships sort of developing, moving forwards, how, like with the young people climbing all over things, how do we engage different sectors of society with that journey? Sorry, there's a lot there. But
I think it's difficult because going back to my own childhood, there weren't computers, there was no technology, and we just were left to go out into the countryside, and it was just, you know, then you'd come back for tea. Nobody bothered really, and you went in somebody's houses and said, "Can I have a glass of water, Mrs. So and So?" and it was all right. You know, I mean, I know but it also had its, I don't want to go back to some nostalgic past. I'm just saying there's problems with maybe with technology where as humans we're getting divorced from our relationship with nature and our relationship with the planet, which concerns me a bit. Obviously, as an individual, I can only carry on doing what I do, but I have thought about trying to making more of a political statement as an artist about the environment. But personally, I feel a little bit uncomfortable. I'm still just trying to stay true to what I am as an artist and not try to grab hold of the political side of it, although I am in sympathy with it, you know. I don't know if that makes any sense or answers your question, but I think we have to look at the way we relate to the planet and to the environment. I think maybe it will happen.
I think the thing about rivers is, again, you know, this mill wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the river, and then that railway viaduct wouldn't be here. So, you know, human settlements always take place alongside rivers, don't they? We actually wouldn't exist without rivers. And in this country, some of our rivers are dying.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people do actually care about that. It's just that we need to find a way to engage that. We're kind of a bit disconnected, perhaps, from what it actually means. I think it's a sort of, on a deep level, I think people do feel it, that there's something really crucial is happening. And whether it's industrial pollution or farmland or just the things that we put into rivers and what we take out of them, it's going to be reflected back to us, and we have to do something about it. And I think for if there's a way that you can do your work and engage that conversation, then that's all to the good. It's not necessarily, in fact, I think probably imaginative ways of engaging with that is probably the way, because I think part of the problem is what I said before about that horizontal and that vertical is we live on a plane where we've made everything logical and fact-based and to do with statistics, and of course it is. But that's only one part of reality, and we behave as if that's the whole reality, but it isn't. You know, there's a kind of a poetic and a mythic, you know, we think of myths as something that aren't true, but myths are they're a different kind of truth, and we need a new myth. We need new myths to live by, and we don't even understand half the time. I think that's what we're lacking, and it is that imaginative leap that needs to be taken, because I think people do care. I think people do, but we're still letting it happen. The Calder is one of the worst rivers in the country. That's shocking. It's really shocking. We ought to, you know, I don't know why we're not absolutely enraged about it. I really don't. I think we've become numb. I think people are a bit numb, actually, about the scale of the problem. And that's not just to do, it's not necessarily climate change, it's just it's our behaviour, what we're doing, or behaviour that we're allowing to go on in our name, and we do need to do something about it, because without rivers there's no life. We're not going to have a life without rivers.
Well, the other day when you were talking about the Euphrates and the Nile, the Fertile Crescent in Egypt. You know, it's often kind of pointed to as the birth of civilization, which I think is a very Eurocentric idea. But, you know, it was this idea of a plain between two rivers as being, you know, the source, the birth of this idea of being civilized, which, although it's Eurocentric, you know, it's this idea of how we be civil in a civil society, and how we work with and contribute and build towards a civic space where we have a voice and we can take action.
Yeah, we were talking about it. I'd seen this thing that the 4 rivers came out of the Garden of Eden, and two of those rivers are what we know as the Tigris and the Euphrates, and that's where Mesopotamia was, which is seen as the first civilization. So that the word Mesopotamia, I think in Greek, actually means between the rivers. And so it had struck me that when we walk down here, we're walking between the rivers, and there's something about that, there's something very fundamental about those rivers and the journey that they're making and that human beings make with them. You know, that's part of our journey, that's part of who we are. It's a really important part of who we are. And we need to get back to something of that Garden of Eden. It's still there, but we're...
Except for the utility companies keep pumping raw sewage into it, so, you know.
To pull you onto politics.
I know.
Yeah.
If any more questions or comments or thoughts?
I've just got a brief comment, but there's a knot in the wood which is used as a sunset or a sunrise.
Yes.
Which I really like.
Yeah, I did some work a while back on plywood where I used the wood grain to be like the water flowing through. So a knot would be like a boulder in the river. I've always quite liked that. I was tempted with this to play around with that because it flows with the grain quite nicely. So, and when you're doing a woodcut, it's inevitable at some point you come across a knot in a very nice place, and then you suddenly think, well, maybe I can incorporate it into something. That's one of the sort of happy accidents of being an artist, you know, or you blot your paper and when you didn't want to, and then you think, oh well, I'll have to use the blot. It's the beauty of intuition, really, when you're being intuitive. So yeah, I was aware of the flowing nature of wood, and now it alludes to rivers. Yeah.
That's great. If there's no more questions, I'll call it to an end, and we could probably just chat in the space afterwards if you want to. So it's time to thank Richard and Louise for their work and for their
thank you.
time today, and a big thank you to David and Joanne and their team from IOU. Quite a few people, when I've been kind of saying, oh, you've got to come to the show, it's IOU, and they're saying, well, that's a daft name. What's that? Why have they called an arts organisation IOU? And I said, well, you know, it's a way to think about IOU is to think about it as just as a phrase. It refers to a promise, doesn't it? A promise to pay back, a promise to give back.
Yeah.
And I think it's an organisation that does, and it has done in supporting us at 9A and placing this here. So thank you very much, IOU. And your artists.